She had to know what was going on. But she feared that finding out would be more dangerous than she could imagine. The room was silent, except for the faint crackling of the fire in the living room. Maya's heart thudded in her chest as she sat frozen, trying to process everything. Jason, standing across the table from her, looked like a stranger, his face tense, jaw clenched. Paul stood just behind him, his posture casual but unsettlingly predatory. There was a strange energy between them, one that Maya couldn't quite place but could feel in every nerve of her body. Maya, Jason's voice was strained, his eyes not quite meeting hers. I think you need to understand that this isn't personal. The words hit her like a punch in the gut, and she felt a cold shiver slide down her spine. What's going on, Jason? Why is he here? Why are you acting like this? Her voice trembled despite her best efforts to keep it steady. Every inch of her screamed that something was terribly wrong, and the familiar warmth of their home felt like a distant memory. Jason opened his mouth to speak, but the words seemed to die on his lips. His gaze flicked to Paul, who gave a barely perceptible nod, as if confirming something. I'm sorry, Maya, Jason said, his voice barely a whisper. I should have told you sooner, but I didn't want you to get caught up in this. This is something I couldn't avoid. Maya's heart sank. Caught up in what, Jason? She could feel her pulse pounding in her ears. What do you mean? Before Jason could answer, Paul stepped forward, his face a mask of calculated calm. What Jason means is that we've been doing this dance for far too long. It's time to end it. Maya recoiled slightly, the words cutting through her like ice. What are you talking about? She demanded, her breath coming faster now. Her mind was racing. She had to be missing something, this couldn't be real, could it? Jason had been her best friend, her confidant. He couldn't be part of something like this. Paul's smile was slow and chilling. You don't know the whole story, do you? He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. You've been living in a dream, Maya. But the reality is much darker. Jason and we've been working together for a long time. You were never supposed to be a part of it. But now that you're here, now that you know, he trailed off, his eyes gleaming with something malevolent. Jason stepped forward, his eyes flashing with a mixture of guilt and something far more unsettling. I didn't want this for you, Maya. I really didn't. But this is how it has to be. Maya stood up, her legs unsteady beneath her, though she fought to keep her composure. What is this? What are you talking about? Her voice shook as she spoke, but there was no mistaking the determination in her tone. Whatever was happening, she was not going to be a passive bystander. She needed to understand what she was facing. Paul didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked at Jason, almost as if waiting for permission. Jason seemed to hesitate, but then his gaze hardened, and he nodded, almost imperceptibly. This is about money, Jason finally said, his voice clipped, as if each word was painful to utter. Things got complicated, Maya. Things got out of hand. I didn't have a choice. Paul, he's part of something bigger. He needed my help, and I got caught up in it. But now, with you here, it's all coming to a head. Maya's chest tightened as she tried to process his words. What kind of something bigger? What is going on, Jason? Her voice was a mix of desperation and anger now, the betrayal and confusion eating away at her. This wasn't the Jason she knew. This wasn't the man who had been her closest friend. Jason lowered his eyes, avoiding her gaze. I'm sorry. I should have told you before it went this far. I never meant for you to get hurt. Paul laughed, a cold, hollow sound. Hurt. She'll be much more than hurt, Jason. You really think you can just walk away from this? From me? He stepped forward again, his eyes locked onto Maya, his grin widening. You should have stayed away, Maya. You should have never invited me in. The words sent a chill racing down her spine. Invited me in. The implication was clear. This was all part of some scheme that had started long before tonight. It wasn't just an innocent dinner. It had been a trap from the beginning. Maya backed away, her hands trembling as she tried to make sense of everything. "What do you want?" she demanded, her voice growing firmer despite the fear that gripped her chest. "What are you going to do?" Paul's expression darkened, and Jason's face twisted with regret. "It's too late for that," Paul said, his voice now cold and final. "There's nothing you can do. You're in this now, Maya. We both are." Jason's eyes were filled with sorrow, but he said nothing. Maya could see the fear in his eyes, the realization that he was as much a victim in this as she was. But it was too late for apologies now. Too late to undo the damage that had already been done. Paul stepped closer, a sinister presence that filled the room. "The only thing left is how this ends, Maya," he said, his voice dangerously soft. "And I don't plan on letting you walk away." Maya's pulse raced, her breath shallow as she stood her ground, trying to process the horrifying truth of what was unfolding before her. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to escape this nightmare that had somehow come crashing into her life. But there was nowhere to go. The front door was locked, the windows sealed shut by the storm outside. She was trapped. Jason's face was a mixture of regret and fear, but his voice was firm. "Maya, please," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You don't understand. I never wanted this." She turned toward him, her eyes filled with a mix of anger and disbelief. "Then what the hell is going on, Jason? Who is this man, and why is he here?" Jason didn't answer, his eyes flickering toward Paul. Maya's heart skipped a beat. Whatever was happening, it was beyond her comprehension now. Jason had just admitted to being involved in something dangerous, something that had a hold on him. And Paul? Paul was a cold, calculating stranger, with no qualms about pulling Maya into this dark world of his. Paul stepped forward, a menacing smile curling on his lips. "This doesn't have to be hard, Maya," he said, his tone sickly sweet. "You can make this easy for both of us. All you have to do is cooperate. Jason made a mistake letting you in on this, but we can fix that. I just need you to." Before he could finish, Maya snapped into action. The fear that had paralyzed her moments ago was replaced by a surge of adrenaline, a primal need to survive. She bolted for the door, her heart pounding in her chest. But just as her hand reached the handle, Paul was there. He grabbed her wrist, his grip like iron, pulling her away from the door. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be," he growled, twisting her arm painfully. The sudden rush of pain sent a shock through her, but Maya wasn't about to give up. She used the moment of shock to swing her elbow backward, connecting with his stomach. Paul grunted, releasing her for a split second. Maya wasted no time, sprinting for the kitchen. She needed something, anything, to defend herself. Her mind raced, the kitchen cabinets flying open in her mind's eye, until she spotted the knife block by the counter. She grabbed the largest knife she could find, her hands shaking as she gripped the handle. Jason's voice, full of panic, called out from behind her. "Maya, please don't. It's not worth it." But Maya didn't stop. She couldn't stop. She wasn't about to let herself be another victim in this twisted game. Paul was closing in fast, but Maya turned just in time, holding the knife in front of her like a barrier. "Stay away from me," she shouted, her voice raw, the knife gleaming under the dim light. Her heart was still racing, but now there was fire in her eyes. She wouldn't let Paul get any closer. Not now. Not ever. Paul sneered, stepping back as he sized her up, clearly unfazed by her attempt to defend herself. "You think that's going to stop me? You think I'm afraid of a little knife?" Maya's grip tightened around the handle, her resolve growing stronger by the second. She wasn't going to let him win. Not after everything. Not after what she'd already been through. The man in front of her may have been dangerous, but she had something he didn't: desperation. She would fight for her life. Paul lunged again, but Maya was faster. She ducked to the side, narrowly avoiding his grasp. Her knife sliced through the air, catching Paul off guard. The tip grazed his arm, drawing blood. For a moment, the surprise was evident in his eyes, but it was quickly replaced by rage. "You shouldn't have done that," he hissed, his eyes darkening. Maya's breath came in ragged gasps as she backed away. Jason was still standing frozen by the door, his expression conflicted, torn between the man who had helped orchestrate this nightmare and the woman he'd once called his best friend. She didn't know if he was trying to process what had just happened or if he was still loyal to Paul. "Jason, please." Maya's voice broke, desperate for him to understand. "This isn't you. You don't have to do this." Jason's eyes flickered, a brief moment of hesitation crossing his face, but then he turned away, his back to her. "I'm sorry, Maya," he said, his voice hollow. "But I don't have a choice anymore." Paul's laugh was cold, cruel. "You see. He's with me, Maya. He's always been with me. He just didn't have the guts to tell you the truth." A surge of rage shot through her. She couldn't believe it. This man, the one she thought was her friend, had been lying to her all along. The realization hit her like a ton of bricks, but it only fueled her determination to survive. With her knife raised, she moved back, her eyes never leaving Paul's. "I'll never help you," she spat, her voice low but steady. "You'll never get away with this." Paul's expression darkened, and in that moment, she knew that the real battle was just beginning. The tension in the room was suffocating. Maya's knuckles were white as she held the knife in front of her, every nerve in her body screaming at her to run, to escape, but she couldn't. She knew that if she turned her back, Paul would make sure she never saw daylight again. Paul, still sneering, took a step forward, his eyes locked onto her with a cold, calculating stare. "You really think you can take me down with that?" he taunted, his voice dripping with mockery. "You're out of your league, Maya." Jason stood motionless by the door, his face pale, but he made no move to intervene. Maya couldn't decide whether she wanted to scream at him for his betrayal or beg him to stop Paul. Either way, she knew it was too late. Whatever had happened between them was irreversible now. "Stay back." Maya's voice was shaky, but she made sure to keep her stance firm. She needed to project strength. She needed Paul to believe she was in control, even though the terror was clawing at her insides. Paul chuckled, low and menacing. "You don't have to make this harder than it needs to be. Hand me the knife, and I'll let you go." Maya's grip tightened. There was no way she was handing over her only means of defense. "I'd rather die than let you take control," she said, her voice shaking but resolute. "You're making a mistake," Paul hissed, his eyes narrowing. He didn't expect her to fight back like this. Maya could see the flicker of frustration in his expression. The man who had been so sure of his power was now losing his confidence. And that gave her strength. Without warning, Paul lunged at her. Maya's heart pounded in her chest, adrenaline surging as she instinctively sidestepped, narrowly dodging the vicious grab for her arm. She slashed out with the knife, the edge cutting through the air and grazing his side. Paul yelped, more surprised than hurt, but it bought Maya just enough time to put some distance between them. Jason, who had been a passive bystander until now, seemed to snap out of his daze. His face was pale, but a flash of regret crossed his features as he looked from Maya to Paul. "Stop," he said quietly, almost pleading. "This has gone too far." Maya's heart skipped a beat at his words. Was Jason going to finally help her? Was he finally going to do the right thing? But before she could hope for too long, Paul's voice cut through the air like a whip. "Don't even think about it, Jason. You know better than to stand in my way." Jason flinched, his eyes darting nervously between the two of them. But Maya could see the conflict in his expression. He was lost, torn between the man he'd once been and the monstrous figure Paul had become. And in that brief moment, Maya realized that no matter what, she was on her own. There was no rescue coming. No hero. It was just her and Paul now. As if on cue, Paul charged again, faster this time. Maya had barely a second to react. With every ounce of strength in her body, she thrust the knife forward. Her hand shook, the blade trembling as it drove into Paul's side. He staggered back, eyes wide with shock, his breath coming in ragged gasps. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. Paul's hand went to his side, his eyes locked onto Maya's in disbelief. Blood seeped between his fingers, but he didn't collapse. Instead, he looked at her with fury, rage pouring off him in waves. "You think that's going to stop me?" he growled, voice low and venomous. "You think I'm done?" Maya's pulse hammered in her ears as she stepped back, trying to control the panic rising in her chest. She had to keep her wits. She couldn't let him get to her. "I'll do whatever it takes to survive, Paul," she said, voice steely. He roared in anger, stumbling toward her with renewed ferocity. But as he lunged, his weakened body couldn't keep up with the speed of his rage. He staggered, his foot slipping on the wet floor, and Maya took the opportunity to strike again. This time, the knife found its mark. With one final, desperate thrust, Maya drove the blade deep into his chest, her hands slick with blood. Paul's eyes widened in shock and pain, his mouth opening as if to speak, but no words came. He crumpled to the floor, the fight drained from him. Maya stood over him, her breathing ragged, her hands trembling. Her vision blurred with exhaustion, but she didn't dare look away. Not yet. Not until she knew for sure that Paul was gone. She needed to make sure this nightmare was finally over. She stood frozen for a moment, her mind still reeling from the chaos, before the heavy weight of reality came crashing down. It was over. The fight, the terror, the struggle. She had won. But the victory tasted bitter. The man she had once trusted, Jason, was still standing there, a mere shadow of the friend he used to be. He hadn't helped her, hadn't saved her. He had been part of this nightmare from the start. "Jason," Maya's voice broke, a mix of sorrow and anger flooding her words. You could have stopped him. Why didn't you?" Jason looked away, his face full of shame. "I couldn't," he whispered. "I was too deep in. But I never wanted you to be part of this." Maya shook her head, feeling a chill settle in her bones. "It's too late for apologies," she said softly. "But thank you for doing the right thing in the end." Jason didn't respond, his face a mask of regret. Maya turned her gaze to the body on the floor, the man who had almost taken everything from her. But now, he was gone. And she was still standing. Maya stood there, breathing heavily, her body trembling from the surge of adrenaline that was slowly ebbing away. The house, once filled with the warmth of Christmas lights and the promise of a peaceful holiday, now felt cold and oppressive. The air was thick with the stench of blood, the once joyful atmosphere replaced by the heavy silence that followed the violence. Jason took a few tentative steps toward her, his face pale, his hands hanging by his sides. He looked as if he didn't know what to say, as if words could never undo the damage that had been done. And in some ways, they couldn't. "I never meant for it to end like this," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. Maya glanced at him, her eyes hard, but there was no anger left in her. Only a hollow ache. She had fought for her life tonight, and in doing so, she had lost so much more than she could ever have imagined. The betrayal, the terror, the uncertainty, it had all shattered something deep inside her. "You didn't stop him when you had the chance, Jason," Maya said, her voice steady, but it carried the weight of everything she'd been through. "You were part of this. And no amount of apologies can take that away." Jason's head hung lower, his face crumpling under the weight of her words. "I'm sorry," he said again, but it felt empty now. A hollow echo in a room that had been filled with too many lies. Maya didn't respond. She turned her back to him, her mind racing. She had made it through this night. She had survived, but what would come next? She could never forget what had happened here. The trust she had placed in Jason, in Paul, both of them had betrayed her, and that was something that would haunt her for a long time. Slowly, she moved toward the door, her legs weak beneath her. The winter night outside seemed so far removed from the chaos that had unfolded inside. But as she stepped into the cold air, it was as though a weight lifted from her shoulders. She had survived. Jason didn't follow her, and Maya didn't expect him to. She walked into the night, leaving behind a nightmare and the ghosts of a broken Christmas. Weeks passed, and the wounds, both physical and emotional, began to heal, though some scars would never fade. Maya had returned to her normal life, but the peace she had once known felt foreign. The trauma lingered in the corners of her mind, like a shadow that never fully disappeared. She had tried to tell herself that the nightmare was over, but the memories still haunted her in quiet moments. Jason, after everything that had happened, was nowhere to be found. Maya didn't expect him to reach out, and truth be told, she didn't want to hear from him. There was no forgiveness in her heart for him, only the cold reality that trust could never be repaired. But she had learned something valuable through this ordeal. She was stronger than she ever thought possible. The Christmas Eve terror had tested her in ways she never imagined, but she had come out of it alive. And that was enough. Maya moved on, slowly rebuilding her life with the courage to leave the past behind. The memory of that night would stay with her, but she refused to let it define her. She was no longer the victim. She was the survivor. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this intense tale of survival, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more gripping stories. Make sure to check out the videos appearing on the screen for more thrilling adventures. Stay safe, and we'll see you next time.